Jim Dawson had seen a lot of bizarre things on his farm, but this was new. The first thing he noticed when he walked out to the hay shed that morning wasn't the fresh country air or the golden sunrise stretching across the land. It was a sleek, white luxury vehicle sitting dead center in his barn, right where his tractor was supposed to be. At first, he thought maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the long nights of tending to the farm were finally messing with his sanity. But no, the car was real, and so was the woman standing next to it, inspecting her nails like she had all the patience in the world. Jim stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The woman, blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, expensive-looking branded purse slung over her shoulder, hadn't even noticed him yet. She was busy tapping away on her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that she was trespassing on someone else's land. He cleared his throat loud enough to shake the birds from the beams. The woman barely glanced up. "Morning," Jim said, keeping his voice steady. "Something I can help you with?" She let out a dramatic sigh, as if he had just asked her to solve a calculus equation. "Oh, you must be the farmer," she said, giving him a once-over, her lips twitching in mild disapproval at his dusty jeans and work boots. "I was just looking for a place to park for a bit." Jim blinked. "You parked in my hay shed?" She nodded, completely unfazed. "Yeah, all the other spots were occupied." She waved a manicured hand toward the vacant field beside them. Jim followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "Ma'am, there's an entire open pasture right there." She sighed again, this time with a little more irritation. "Right, but I needed some shade. Do you have any idea how hot it gets in a car without air conditioning?" She fanned herself dramatically. "Besides, I won't be long." Jim folded his arms across his chest. He dealt with stubborn animals, unpredictable weather, and the occasional farm equipment disaster, but nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for a full-blown Karen. "This ain't a parking space," he said, jerking a thumb toward the barn. "I need this space to work," she scoffed. "I'll only be a few hours." You can work around it." He let out a slow breath, willing himself to stay composed. "Lady, you're on my property. You can't just." She held up a finger, cutting him off. "I'm on an urgent call." Jim's left eye twitched. This woman had just interrupted him on his land to take a phone call. He watched, dumbfounded, as she turned her back to him and started chattering into her phone like he wasn't even there. "No, Brenda, I told you I need the organic soy latte, not that processed garbage of just fix it." She let out an exasperated sigh. "Anyway, I'm at some farm or whatever, just waiting until my lunch reservation." Jim clenched his jaw so hard he was surprised his teeth didn't crack. The gall of this woman, the absolute nerve. He could have argued with her, could have yelled, could have called the sheriff, and had her towed, but something in his gut told him none of that would work. She wasn't the kind of person who responded to reasoning. No, she needed something else. Something bigger, something unforgettable. His gaze flickered toward the towering stacks of hay bales lined up just outside the barn. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. If she wanted to leave her car here so badly, well, maybe he'd help make sure it stayed secure. Jim turned on his heel and strolled toward the barn entrance, humming. He spotted his farmhands, Cody and Matt, taking a water break by the tractor. "Boys," Jim said, rubbing his hands together, "I've got a task for you." It took less than 10 minutes. The first few bales of hay were stacked gently, almost politely, around the car. But as Karen kept chattering on the phone, blissfully unaware, the boys picked up speed. Soon, hay was dropping left and right, piling up higher and taller. By the time they reached 30 bales, Cody had to stand on the back of the truck just to toss them over. Jim leaned against a post, watching as the final few bales were carefully arranged into place. And still Karen talked. "So I told him, if you're not flying first class, then why even travel at all?" she was saying, laughing as if she had just delivered the funniest joke in the world. Then finally, she turned and shrieked, What have you done to my car?" Jim bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Karen's pristine white sedan was now a buried treasure, completely covered under 50 bales of tightly packed hay. Only the very tip of the antenna peeked out from the golden mound. Karen spun toward Jim, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Move it. Move it right now. Jim scratched his chin. I don't know. Seems pretty stuck to me. Her hands clenched into fists. This is unlawful. You can't just bury my car. Jim raised a brow. Oh, and what do you call parking on someone else's property without approval? That's different, she stammered. Do you even know who I am? I have influence. I'll call the mayor. Jim crossed his arms. Go ahead. She yanked out her phone and dialed furiously. After a few seconds, her face twisted into confusion. What do you mean he's unavailable? Ugh. She hung up, nostrils flaring. Fine. I'll call the authorities. Jim shrugged. You do that. Karen stormed a few feet away, jabbing at her phone as she dialed 911. Meanwhile, Cody and Matt exchanged looks, barely holding back their chuckles. Jim stood there unbothered, while Karen ranted at the dispatcher. Yes, I'd like to report a crime this horrible man has committed. Agricultural sabotage or something. I don't know. Just send someone now. She hung up with a huff and turned back toward Jim. You're going to regret this. Jim smiled. We'll see. 15 minutes later, a familiar sheriff's truck pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Dale stepped out, pushing his sunglasses up his nose as he examined the scene. His eyes flicked from Jim to the massive hay pile, then to Karen, who was now on the verge of throwing an absolute tantrum. What's going on here? Dale asked, sounding more exhausted than anything. Karen stormed forward. This man has trapped my car. Arrest him. Dale scratched his head. You mean the car that's parked inside his barn on his land? Karen blinked. Yes, and Dale sighed, rubbing his temples. Karen, did you even ask before parking? Here Karen flailed her arms. I didn't think I had to. It's a barn. Jim leaned toward Dale and said deadpan. I just thought I'd help make sure her car was nice and comfortable. Cody let out a snort. Dale exhaled slowly, then turned to Karen. Lady, you better hope I don't fine you for trespassing. Karen's jaw dropped. What? Jim just smiled. Oh, this was far from finished. Karen screamed. Fraud echoed across the farm, a high-pitched wail that sent a few birds scattering from the barn rafters. Jim had expected some level of outrage, maybe even a tantrum, but the sheer dramatic performance unfolding in front of him was almost impressive. She stomped her designer-heeled foot into the dirt, arms flailing like a windmill caught in a hurricane. You absolute, you backwoods you, I can't believe this, she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at the mountain of hay still sitting atop her luxury vehicle. Do you have any idea who I am? Jim, arms folded across his chest, studied her with the same level of concern he'd give a particularly irritating fly buzzing around his face. Still haven't figured that part out, he said, but I do know you parked on my land without asking, refused to move when I asked politely, and now you're causing more of a fuss than my cows do when they miss breakfast. Karen's mouth flapped open and shut as she tried to process the words. For a moment, she seemed to be at a loss, as if the idea of someone not instantly giving in to her demands was foreign to her. But then, her face twisted, lips curling into something between a sneer and a snarl. She jabbed a perfectly manicured finger into the air. You will remove this hay right now. Jim rocked back on his heels, pretending to ponder. You know, I'd love to, but my back's been acting up recently. Maybe if I had a motive. Karen's eyes nearly bulged out of her head. A motive? My car is buried under a pile of farm debris. You want a motive? How about I sue you for destruction of property? Jim shrugged. Go right ahead. But since this is private property and you parked here without consent, you might just end up paying me for damages. Karen let out a strangled noise somewhere between a gasp and a growl. Then her face lit up with sudden realization. Fine. You leave me no choice. She whipped out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm calling the authorities. You'll be in handcuffs before the hour is up. Jim nodded. All right, go ahead. Karen blinked, thrown off by his lack of concern. Wait, you're not intimidated? Jim chuckled. Nah, Karen. You see, our sheriff ain't too fond of trespassers, so I reckon I'll be just fine. Karen's triumphant smirk faltered slightly, but she still pressed the phone to her ear. Jim watched as she launched into a dramatic retelling of events, her voice shifting from enraged to tearful within seconds. "Yes, officer, I need urgent assistance. A crazed farmer has committed an act of sabotage against my vehicle. It's an emergency. My property is being held hostage." Jim exchanged a glance with Cody and Matt, who were both barely holding in their laughter. Karen suddenly snapped, "What do you mean? It's private property. I don't care. I need someone out here now." She paused, her face twisting further as the response on the other end clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. "Well, you know what? I'll just sue the entire department. And the mayor." And she went silent, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, what does that have to do with?" "No, I don't have permission to be here." "But that's not the point." "Hello? Hello?" Karen slowly pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the screen in horror. "They disconnected on me," she whispered, sounding genuinely baffled. Jim nodded. "Yeah, Dale doesn't have much patience for prank calls." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Oh, we'll see about that." She turned sharply, folding her arms. "Fine, I'll wait for the police to come to their senses and deal with you properly." Jim let out an amused breath. "You do that." It took about 15 minutes before Sheriff Dale's truck pulled up. Jim watched as the man stepped out, taking his sweet time as he adjusted his belt and pushed his sunglasses up his face. He took one long look at the hay-covered car, then at Karen, then at Jim Dale. "Thank goodness you're here." Karen practically ran to him, grabbing onto his sleeve as if she had just been rescued from a burning structure. "This brute," she pointed at Jim like he was some kind of outlaw, "has committed an offense against me." Dale gave Jim a slow, knowing look that said everything. "Yes," Karen cried. "He buried my car. I demand you arrest him immediately." Dale exhaled through his nose. "You trespassed on his land." Karen's face twitched. "That's not the issue." Dale rubbed his temple. "Pretty sure it is the issue." Karen stomped her foot again. "I have entitlements." Dale crossed his arms. "And Jim here has the right to not have strangers abandon their vehicles in his hayshed." Karen looked ready to explode. "So you're just going to let this countryman get away with vehicular entrapment?" Dale tilted his head. "Vehicular? What now?" Karen's hands flailed. "He trapped my car. This is unlawful. I have influence. I will have your position." Dale pulled out a notepad, flipping it open. "Let's see you parked on private property without approval, ignored the landowner's request to leave, then called me out here for a non-emergency, which, mind you, is actually prohibited." Karen's mouth snapped shut. Dale nodded. "That about sum it up, Jim." Jim fought the urge to smirk. "Sounds about right." Karen gasped. You can't be serious." "He's the culprit here." Dale sighed, closing the notepad. "Lady, best thing you can do right now is apologize. Have Jim and his boys move the hay and leave without causing more problems." Karen stood there, shaking with fury. "Apologize," she spat, like the word itself was venom. "I would rather drop." Jay shrugged. "All right, then." He turned back toward his house, making it clear he had no intention of touching the hay anytime soon. Karen sputtered. "Wait, where are you going? You can't just leave my car like this." Jim tossed a lazy wave over his shoulder. "Sure can." Karen let out a strangled screech. Dale shook his head. "I got about a dozen real concerns to deal with today. If you don't want to do things the easy way, you can take it up with the judiciary, but I wouldn't count on them siding with the trespasser." Karen was vibrating with fury, her perfectly styled hair now slightly frizzed from all her dramatic movements. For a brief second Jim wondered if she might actually burst. But then her shoulders dropped, her nostrils flared, and she clenched her jaw so tight he could hear her teeth grinding. "Fine," she finally spat. "Get this junk off my car." Jim smirked. "Say please." Karen looked like she wanted to throw something at his head. Instead, she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply through her nose. After a moment, she muttered, "Please." Jim clapped his hands together. "See? That wasn't so hard." With the help of his farm hands, the hay was carefully removed, one bale at a time. But the moment Karen's car was fully uncovered, the real trouble began. The weight of the hay had done a number on the vehicle. The windshield had fractured. The roof had caved in slightly, and the doors were completely jammed shut. Karen let out a shriek that probably registered on the Richter scale. Jim whistled low. "Well, that's unfortunate." Karen spun toward him, eyes frenzied. "You are finished." Jim just smiled. "We'll see." Karen stood there, fists clenched, eyes wild, breathing like a bull about to charge. Jim had seen a lot of angry people in his life, angry cows, angry neighbors, even an angry possum once. But nothing quite compared to a full-blown Karen realizing she wasn't going to win. Her face had turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Her hands were shaking. And for a moment, Jim wondered if she might actually start throwing punches. "My car," she choked out, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "My beautiful, expensive, imported automobile." Jim tilted his head, pretending to examine the damage. The windshield was fractured. The roof had a slight dent, and the doors weren't budging, no matter how hard Karen tugged on them. He let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that's unfortunate," he said, though there wasn't a hint of sympathy in his voice. Karen turned to him, nostrils flaring. You did this to my car." Jim shrugged. "I didn't do anything, just stack some weight, did the rest." Karen's eye twitched. You are going to pay for this. I will sue you for every cent you have." Jim sighed, wiping his hands on his pants. "Well, you're welcome to try, but I have a feeling you're going to have a real hard time convincing a judge that you, someone who trespassed onto private property, refused to leave, and unlawfully parked in someone's hay shed, are the victim here." Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for some kind of rebuttal, but nothing came out. Sheriff Dale, still standing nearby with his arms crossed, finally spoke up. "Hate to break it to you, lady, but Jim's got a point. You're the one in trouble here." Karen whirled toward him, eyes practically bulging. "Me? You should be arresting him. This is destruction. This is property damage. This is. Dale pulled a folded-up document from his pocket and held it out to her. "This is a fine. $10,000 for trespassing, unauthorized parking, and filing a false police report." Karen stopped mid-motion. The color drained from her face so fast that Jim thought for a second she might pass out. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She blinked once, twice, then she let out a strangled sound. $10,000. Dale nodded. "Might even be more if the mayor decides to add penalties." Karen let out a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a scream. That's outrageous. That's unlawful. You can't do this to me." Dale tucked his notebook back into his pocket. "Pretty sure I can. And I just did." Karen was trembling now, gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. "I'll fight this," she whispered almost to herself. "I'll fight this in court." "Court I'll." Jim smirked. "Well, that's one option." He rubbed his chin as if considering something. "Or you could make a bargain." Karen snapped her head toward him. "A bargain?" Jim nodded. "Yep. See, instead of paying that fine, you could work it off." Karen's face contorted. "Labor here." Jim shrugged. 200 hours on the farm should just about cover it. Feeding the cows, baling hay, fixing fences." He grinned. "You know, actual work." Karen's face twisted in disgust. "Absolutely not." Jim nodded. "All right, then." He turned back toward his house. "Guess you better figure out how you're paying that 10 grand. Karen stood frozen, her entire body rigid. For a moment, Jim thought she might actually take the deal. She looked at the sheriff, then at the fine in her hands, then back at Jim. But just as quickly, her ego took over. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and glared at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of her designer heels. "I'll pay the fine," she spat. Jim shrugged. "Suit yourself." Karen turned away furiously, typing into her phone. Jim could hear the absolute venom in her voice as she called someone, probably her attorney, her spouse, maybe whoever usually rescued her from trouble. But Jim wasn't concerned. He had won. The tow truck arrived an hour later, much to Karen's horror. The driver took one look at the wrecked car. Let out a long whistle and shook his head. Going to cost a fortune to repair this, he muttered. Karen looked ready to erupt again. She had screamed, argued, even threatened. But the reality of the situation had finally sunk in. She had failed as the tow truck hauled her car away. She turned back toward Jim one last time, her eyes filled with pure loathing. "You are the most horrible human being I have ever met," she hissed. Jim smiled. "Ah, shucks. You flatter me." Karen let out a noise that might have been an attempt at a retort, but she was already storming away. Before she could think of anything, she climbed into the passenger seat of a waiting taxi, slammed the door so hard that the driver flinched, and just like that, she was gone. The second the car pulled away, Cody let out a whoop. "That was the greatest thing I have ever seen." Matt wiped tears from his eyes. "Man, I thought she was going to burst at the end there." Jim shook his head, chuckling. "She might still." Sheriff Dale sighed. "That woman's been a headache in my life for years. Wouldn't be surprised if she leaves town after this one." Turns out he was right. A few days later, the mayor himself stopped by the farm just to shake Jim's hand. Apparently, Karen had a long history of causing chaos in town, and this had been the final incident. Word had gotten around fast, and by the time the fine had been officially processed, Karen had packed up and left town. But the real reward came a week later when someone from the local feed store showed up with a surprise. Jim unfolded the large poster and burst out laughing. It was a perfectly edited image of Karen's car buried under hay, with the words, "Parking, you're doing it incorrectly." Jim hung it up in the barn, and every time he looked at it, he smiled.